The new batch, 1934 World Cup, Italy. Italy would become the second nation to ever host the World Cup and the first nation from Europe. Unlike the 1930 World Cup, the 1934 World Cup, and every World Cup since has had a qualifying round, what is unique for Italy in this World Cup is that they will become the first and to this day the only nation to have to qualify for the very same tournament that they are hosting. Italy would have to play Greece home and away to qualify for the 1934 World Cup. Only one game in this group was played, and that was the match between Italy and Greece in the San Siro, where both AC Milan and Inter Milan played their home games at. The match took place on the 25th of March 1934. Italy would beat Greece 4-0. Italy would score 2 goals in both halves. The first goal came in the 40th minute from Filogino Garesi, scored for Italy, making him the very first goal scorer in a World Cup qualifiers match for Italy. He did have a couple of caps for Brazil as well early on. He was born in Brazil in Sao Paulo. 4 minutes later, Italy would double their lead. Giuseppe Marassa scored. And then in the second half, Giovanni Ferrari would make it 3-0. He scored in the 69th minute. And then Giuseppe Marassa will double the amount of goals he scored for Italy in this match, making it 4-0 to them over Greece. He would also become the very first player to score 2 goals in a World Cup qualifying match for Italy. Greece withdrew, declined to play the next game, and with that, Italy qualified for their first World Cup as the hosts. Okay, so that's how Italy qualified for their first ever World Cup, even though they were the hosts. I want to point out that there's actually a few players in the Italian team and the 1934 team that I would mention earlier on, if you don't know already, that do go on to win the World Cup. A few of them did actually play for Argentina in the past. But the one player of note, of key note, that I should mention is Luis Monti, who happened to be Argentina's very first goal scorer at the World Cup. He also played in the final of the 1930 World Cup, where Argentina was defeated by Uruguay. Alright, so with that said, Italy would go up against the USA who was able to reach the semi-finals of the previous tournament. They became the first and to this day only nation from the CONCACAF ever to reach the Final Four, which they were knocked out by Argentina. Interesting enough, Luis Monti, who now played for Italy at that time, at the 1934 World Cup, did open the scoring up in that game where they were beaten 6-1. In this game though, Italy defeats the USA by 7-1. This would remain to this day Italy's biggest win at the World Cup, and crazy enough it was in their debut match, and to this day still the USA's biggest defeat. The match took place in the Stadio Nazionale, which would also be the stadium where the final match would be played. Angelo Schiavio in the 18th minute became Italy's very first goal scorer at the World Cup. And only 2 minutes later, Raimondo Orsi would become the second goal scorer from Italy to ever score at the World Cup. Orsi is one of the players that I've mentioned that did play for Argentina. He actually picked up a silver medal for Argentina at the 1928 Olympic Games in Amsterdam, Netherlands. In the 29th minute, Sclavo would increase Italy's lead, now 3-0, and would make him the first player to score 2 goals for Italy at the World Cup. The USA would pick up a goal from Donnelly. They would get a consolation goal scored in the 57th minute. He did score quite a few goals against Mexico for USA to qualify. However, Italy couldn't stop scoring. Giovanni Ferrari, who also scored in the qualifying match for Italy against Greece, scored in the 63rd minute to make it 4-1. Then 1 minute later, Angelo Scalavo would complete his hat-trick for Italy, making him the very first player for Italy to ever score a hat-trick, and that was in his debut and in Italy's debut game. Orsi would also score another goal for himself in the 69th minute, making it 6-1, and right at the end, in the 90th minute, Giuseppe Meazza would make it 7-1 for Italy over the USA. I think this was also the biggest win for a debuting nation at a World Cup match. Great way to start the tournament there for Italy. Quick thing I should mention as well, Italy were one of the seeded teams, hence why they played against USA, who was one of the unseeded teams, even though they were really good at the 1930 World Cup. Also, another thing to mention, this tournament, unlike the 1930 tournament, didn't have a group stage, so all of the matches were straight up knockout competition. And quickly speaking about the 1930 World Cup, all the teams that did compete at that tournament, that did compete at this one as well, all were knocked out in the round of 16, the very first round of the 1934 tournament. The USA and Italy do meet each other again at a World Cup. They meet each other for a second time, once again when Italy do host the World Cup, for a second time in 1990, where once again Italy do win. That game was 1-0 though, a lot less goals in that game, and that was in the group stage. And they meet each other for one final time, or most recently I should mention, in 2006, where they draw 1-1 again in a group stage. Italy would then go on to win the 2006 World Cup, but we're now talking about the first time they do win the World Cup, and that is in 1934. So Italy go through to the quarterfinals. They go up against another European nation. The 1934 World Cup will be the first and only World Cup where all 8 nations in the quarterfinals all happen to be from Europe. Italy play Spain. This match took place in the Stadio Giovanni Berta, now known as the Stadio Ottimo Franchi, where ACF Fiorentina play their home games at. The match between Italy and Spain ended up being 1-1. This will be the first ever quarter-final game to go into extra time. The very first goal scored in this game was by Spain. Luis Rogelio would score in the 30th minute to give Spain the lead there. Italy would equalise though. Giovanni Ferrari scores in the 44th minute to again give Italy the equaliser there. That is his second goal in a row in this tournament, so of course scoring against the USA earlier, and he also scored in a qualifying game, so really good for him there, and obviously for Italy, much needed goal there. The game does go into extra time. The second half of this match, no goals, and then going into extra time, there was no more goals scored. This game between Italy and Spain will be the first time a game at the World Cup would go to a replay. Penalty shootouts wasn't added to the World Cup till the 1970s. So Italy-Spain, they go at it again. This time around though, Italy do beat Spain 1-0, still the same stadium. This time around, Giuseppe Meazza would score the only goal in this game, scoring just 11 minutes in. And with that, Italy reached the semi-finals in their very first World Cup. This match, I believe it might be both of the games. There was a lot of controversial things said about these matches when I looked them up. Italy do meet Spain again, at least when it comes to the World Cup. They meet each other about another 60 years later. in the USA, where Italy do beat Spain again 2-1 in the quarterfinals on their way to the final, where they do end up losing to Brazil at the end. But in the 1934 World Cup, they reached the semi-final for the first time, where they took on Austria in the San Siro. Italy wins this game just by 1-0. Again, this time around, Enrique Guaita would score the solo goal in this game, giving Italy the win here and taking them through to their first ever World Cup final. He did play for Argentina a couple of times back in 1933, then played for Italy for this World Cup, and then would eventually go back and play for Argentina. But with this goal, he scored one of Italy's most important goals at the World Cup. Austria do play Italy a few more times at the World Cup. They played them again in 1978, where Italy once again win. They played them again in 1990, where Italy were the hosts again. Both in Group A, both matches again. Italy keeps beating them 1-0. That's 3 1-0s in a row in World Cup matches. And then in France, again, Italy do beat Austria, but this time around it was 2-1. That's 4 wins for Italy against Austria. Every time they come up against each other at the World Cup, Italy get the best of them. The referee of this match was Ivan Eklund from Sweden, who would also be the referee for the final, where Italy do go up against Czechoslovakia. Ivan Eklund would be the youngest ever referee for a final match at the World Cup. To this day, a record hasn't been broken. He's still the youngest at the age of just 28. So I briefly just mentioned the final. So Italy would take on Czechoslovakia in the Stadio Nazionale, which no longer stands, and again the stadium, for obvious reasons, did change its name. Currently it's now known as the Stadio Flaminio, but it's no longer active. It's no longer an active stadium. I didn't actually go into the stadium myself. I went round it, took a couple of pictures there. It's interesting to see. Regardless, again, that is the final for the very first time that 2 nations from Europe would compete at a final at the World Cup. Italy do go on to beat Czechoslovakia 2-1 at this stadium after extra time. This final will also be the very first final to go to extra time. No goals were scored in the first half, but in the 71st minute for Czechoslovakia, Puck would score. That was the first time he scored a goal for Czechoslovakia since their opening match against France. And 10 minutes later, Orsi would bring Italy back into the game. They were 9 minutes away from losing the final here. That would be his 3rd goal of the tournament. He himself hasn't scored since the opening game against USA. So this match would go into extra time. And then in the 95th minute, Angelo Schiavo would score his 4th goal in the tournament. His 1st goal since his hat-trick against the USA in their 7-1 win in the opening game. This would give Italy the win over Czechoslovakia, and Italy would become the very first nation from Europe to ever win the World Cup, and at the time only the 2nd nation to ever win the World Cup, and the 2nd nation to ever win the World Cup as the hosts. This was a big moment for Italy, sporting history in itself for Italy and for the World Cup. With this win here, Italy do go on to winning the next World Cup in 1938. which made Italy the very first nation to ever retain a World Cup. And also during that tournament, they actually beat the host nation, who was France, which also made Italy the very first nation to defeat a host team at the World Cup. I should also mention this, because of World War II, two World Cups didn't happen, which would have been the 1942 and 1946 World Cup, which makes Italy the nation to hold the World Cup the longest, from 1934 all the way up to 1950. Just before I mention the other two World Cups that Italy win in 1982 and in 2006, Italy do go up against Czechoslovakia another time in 1990, where Italy once again win 2-0. Again, Italy were the hosts of that tournament, and in the same city, Rome, but a completely different stadium, Italy goes on to beat Czechoslovakia again. They do meet, interesting enough, Czechia one time in 2006, where they do go on to win 2-0. But in the next World Cup, they end up losing 3-2 to Slovakia. In 2006, they were on their way to winning the World Cup. So that win against Czechia, big win there. And in 2010, they were the holders, but lost to Slovakia in the group stage. Italy, like I mentioned, do win the World Cup again in 1982 in Spain, and in 2006 in Germany. Big wins there. Though despite the wins they have had, they have lost two finals themselves, both times against Brazil, first in 1970 in Mexico, and again in 1994 in the USA. So that's the two times that the CONCACAF nations have hosted a World Cup. That match against Brazil was the very first time a World Cup match will go into penalties, and it's also the very first World Cup game to end goalless, the first and only World Cup match ever to go goalless. But with that said, Italy's very strong history at football, one of the one of the world giants when it comes to football. I would say this may be one of the weaker eras for them. Despite winning the Euros in 2021, they missed out in the first time in two World Cups back to back. They missed out in 2018 and in 2022. And currently looking at their qualifying campaign for the 2026 World Cup, they're not in the best position right now, though they do have games in hand over the two teams above them, which is currently Norway and Israel as I speak. With that said, it's Italy. They always going to produce talent. They could bounce back again. I won't be surprised. But this is my video for the 1934 Italian team, who became the very first nation from Europe to ever lift the World Cup. And this was my final video of the new batch 1934 World Cup. I appreciate you watching, listening. I do appreciate it as usual. I wish that I uploaded these videos a lot closer to each other than I have. It's been months since the very first video I did, which was the USA one. But this is the finale, this is Italy. So thanks for watching my 1934 new batch Italy video. Thanks for watching, listening, appreciate it as usual. And once again, bye.